Serial killers are often thought of as uncontrollable monsters driven by dark and depraved urges. But the man who terrorized Long Island for 17 years didn't act on impulse. He was organized. He treated murder like a multi-million-dollar skyscraper project, complete with an 87-point technical manual. He had checklists where he noted lessons learned from his previous murders. He was an architect by trade, a man who thought he had engineered the perfect crime, until a single discarded pizza crust in a Manhattan garbage brought his entire blueprint crashing down. After arresting 59-year-old Rex Heuermann in 2023, the Gilgo Homicide Task Force executed numerous search warrants to remove around 350 electronic devices from a one-story property in Massapequa Park, Long Island. Hidden deep in one of the devices was a Microsoft Word document entitled HK 2002-04. The detectives couldn't be sure of the meaning of the initials, though hunt kill or human kill were likely. When they opened it, they found a methodical plan. In a section listed problems, the author reminded himself of how he might get caught. DNA, tire marks, blood stains, fingerprints. In the same section, he'd written MO, plastic bags/cat litter. MO, his modus operandi. He was aware that investigators would be looking for patterns in his behavior. With the obvious problems out of the way, the killer wrote in his supplies section what he would need to buy for his future murders: acid, rope, hairnet, medical gloves, police scanner, tapes. It was an incriminating list. So too was his DS section, a list of dump sites for his victims' bodies. One of them, DS1 Mill Road, was the location where police had already found the remains of a petite woman. Petite because, according to the targets section listed under TRG, that is what he liked. He had written small is good. And once he had his target, he could refer to his pre-prep checklist, from checking the weather reports to inspecting his vehicle and choosing the perfect place to engage his victim. The pick zone would only be chosen after he had conducted recon, and only then could he begin what he called the prep, his staging and holding area where he tortured the women he'd abducted. He would fasten her to a table or use what he called his hard point, what detectives believed was related to suspension bondage. This man was a monster. He would bind, suspend, and torture his victims before finally strangling them. When he was finished, his post-event routine was followed exactly. His checklist for this process included the words destroy file. This was his first major mistake. His other post-murder routines, change tires, burn gloves, dispose of picks, and have story set. Detectives were only halfway through the file. The more disturbing information was to come, but what they had seen already was enough to understand this was the most meticulous killer they had ever investigated. His attention to detail was astounding, but he overlooked one thing. He wasn't quite as smart as he believed. To the people who knew Rex Heuermann, he was one of life's successes. Married to his second wife with 2 grown children, he looked like a regular family man in suburban America. There were small clues, though, that something wasn't quite right, like his house. The rest of the street was a picture of affluence, rows of fine buildings with manicured lawns. But his own house was shabby. The garden was overgrown, everything was in a state of disrepair. Parents would tell their kids on Halloween, "Don't go trick-or-treating at the Heuermann place." No one knew it then, but his house perfectly reflected the beast he was hiding within. It was as if he lived 2 different lives, one for show, one for real. One of his few male friends would later say, "I personally think he disconnects one personality from the other and has no remorse." One side was normal, the other, dark side, psychopathic, Machiavellian, sadistic. At Heuermann's Manhattan architect office, his clients were New York's privileged. No one suspected he was capable of committing crime, and certainly not murdering and torturing women. The kind of women his other persona would never be seen dead with. Drug users, sex workers. His basement held a cache of 279 guns in a vault big enough to walk into, guarded by a thick door. Those who knew him knew how much he loved shooting powerful automatic weapons. But was that all he kept down there? Investigators would one day take the basement apart, fueling speculation that it might have played a role in the murders. There's no conclusive evidence it did, but he tortured those women somewhere, and that somewhere had to have been concealed. The house was one of the strangest things about Heuermann. It was a house of trauma where he had grown up as a child. Yet he stayed there and refused to change anything. It was like a mausoleum of repressed history. It was where his strict father, a World War II veteran, had ruled with an iron fist. He died when Rex was just 12, and his reportedly controlling and domineering mother took over. Whatever happened inside of those walls after that made Heuermann a timid child, a kid with a huge body, yet bullied at school for being mama's boy. Heuermann wore a mask, and the mask never slipped, maybe not even at home. Dear Rex. That's how he was known to his extended family and relatives. They had watched him grow up with his violent father. They had seen the rage inside of him back then, but as an adult, he was always friendly and kind, the first person in the family to arrange reunions. It was the perfect double life, and he thought it made him invincible. By 2020, he was famous. The so-called Long Island serial killer had been featured in film and documentaries and countless podcasts. But the world was looking for a beast, not a family man and an architect with a fancy Manhattan office. Only once did someone suspect he might be a killer. He'd arranged a date with a sex worker. They'd started talking about the local serial killer, and she noticed how excited he became. It was as if he had studied the case, like he thought it was a good thing that those women had been murdered. He'd let his guard down. The mask had slipped slightly. The woman thought about going to the police, but she was wanted on a parole violation, so she kept it to herself. Besides that one incident, no one ever suspected anything. He thought that he had beaten the system. But he was wrong, because he had made another mistake. There was a 2-ton piece of evidence sitting in his driveway, one that would lead to his downfall. Detectives had known for years Long Island had a serial killer. It had all started with a 23-year-old woman named Shannan Gilbert. On May 1, 2010, she was working as an escort when she called 911 from a man's house somewhere in a gated community in Long Island's Oak Beach. "There's somebody after me." She asked the operator to help trace the call. She didn't know where she was. Shannan repeated, "Someone is after me. They're going to kill me." A man's voice was heard in the background. Now she sounded scared. "What are you gonna do to me?" She ran straight to another house. An elderly man let her in, tried to calm her down, but as soon as he turned his back, she ran again. He watched her take off down the street, her face searching for someone coming after her. A number of residents saw her sprinting through the neighborhood. Some of them had heard her desperate sobs, her heavy breathing as she disappeared into the darkness. She was never seen alive again. The man heard in the background, Shannan's client, was questioned by the cops. His name was Joseph Brewer, and it seemed that he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd explained that he had arranged for her to travel the 45 miles from Manhattan for sex. She'd become erratic and paranoid, and he didn't know why. Had he hurt her? The police didn't think so. She had been driven that night to his house. The driver was Michael Pack. He said that he had no idea why she sprinted right past the car as he sat waiting for her to finish. He didn't know what had scared her so much. Both these men weren't even considered persons of interest. The case was a mystery, not helped by the fact that the neighborhood's video security recordings were faulty that night. This would one day fuel suspicion that someone wasn't telling the truth. But at the time, the case didn't even make the news. A missing hooker. That's what cops called her, and they didn't seem interested in trying to even find her when the family were asking questions. Not at first. But 7 months later, in December 2010, the police conducted a thorough search with a cadaver dog unit, and sure enough, they came across a body just off the Ocean Parkway, the area known as Gilgo Beach, just down the road from Oak Beach. It was a skeleton, but they assumed it was Shannan. Only she had a titanium plate in her jaw, the result of a violent boyfriend. The body they found, no metal in its head. It wasn't Shannan. They kept searching, and soon the sky above Long Island turned black. Just a few yards from the first remains, they found 3 more sets of bodies. All bones, for now, Jane Doe's. All of them had been murdered, but none of them were Shannan. This was just the start. In March and April of 2011, they found 6 more sets of remains along the same shore, all of them just bones. But again, none of them were Shannan, and she was important to the case. If she had been murdered by a serial killer, she might have been his most recent. Then on December 13, 2011, they found her. Her clothes and the items she was carrying that night were close by, at the side of the marsh where her decomposed remains were. Richard Dormer, the Suffolk County Police Commissioner at the time, said Shannan was probably high on drugs and suffering from paranoia. The fact that her clothes were discarded must have meant she had torn them off in a fit of hysteria. He even went as far as to say her jeans just must have come off as she was running. Wet jeans? Not something that usually just slips off. To Shannan's family, to the observers, this didn't sound plausible. Famed Chief Medical Examiner Michael Baden entered the picture. Not afraid to go against the grain, Baden told the media that Shannan hadn't gone crazy and ripped off her own clothes. He had called that reasoning absurd. Her hyoid bone had been broken. He believed she died from strangulation. As the public talked about a possible cover-up, law enforcement didn't help their case when they refused to release the body to her family. Neither would they release the full details of the case to the public, including the call Shannan had made to 911. It was 21 minutes of valuable information. There were now 11 bodies, 11 murders, and a mystery. Had they all been victims of the same killer? And the police might have gotten their first breakthrough. They had a potential witness. It was the night 27-year-old Amber Costello had gone missing. The witness said he had seen a middle-aged white guy threatening Costello, who had locked herself in a bathroom. The guy was massive, maybe about 6'6". As he ran off, the witness caught a glimpse of his truck, a dark-colored first-generation Chevy Avalanche. All the police had to do was find a giant white man who drove an Avalanche. How many could there be? And the killer was almost certainly someone very familiar with the area where the bodies had been found. Still, Long Island is huge, with almost 8 million people. Suffolk County alone has just over 1.5 million. This was where the trouble started. The witness statement, rather than being followed up on, seemed to get buried. The man in charge of the local police department, Jimmy Burke, was Suffolk County's highest-ranking police official, and he had a history. He had helped prosecutor Thomas Spoda solve the brutal murder of a local kid who had been beaten to death and had stones shoved into his mouth. Many suspected Burke had lied to help solve what had become a controversial case. Burke rose quickly through the ranks, later jumping many places up the ladder when he landed the job as chief. Now he was working right under the district attorney, Thomas Spoda. Burke got that unlikely promotion despite having 12 internal investigations filed against him. The rumors were rife. He roughed up suspects, mishandled evidence or confiscated items, threatened subordinates, took drugs. Not all proven, but his dirty cop image was well known. And he used prostitutes, a lot of them. One of them later said he was violent and choked her. So when sex workers started turning up dead, a man who had hurt sex workers was running the investigation. The FBI offered to help. The agency had the resources to dig deeper, to build a profile, analyze movements, and create a digital evidence strategy. Burke told them no thanks. He wouldn't allow anyone but his own men to investigate the case, a case that would flounder for years on end. He would later be accused of obstruction. But before that, things got really weird. One night, a junkie named Christopher Loeb stole a bag from a car. Inside it was a stash of pornography and some sex toys. Then his heart dropped when he saw some police cards. He had just robbed a cop, and not any cop, the chief. On December 14, 2012, police went to Loeb's mother's house in Smithtown and arrested him. And that's when they found Burke's very embarrassing stash. At the station, he was held in handcuffs as Burke beat him to a pulp, threatening to give him a shot of heroin and hurt his mom. One of the other cops stepped in, trying to rein in his boss. It was like he was trying to kill Loeb. But that was how Burke finally came undone. He tried to cover it up, but this time he had overstepped the line. He got 46 months in prison for a civil rights violation and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Years later, the man who had protected Burke for 30-something years, D.A. Spota, was sentenced to 5 years for obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and conspiracy. These men had run a highly corrupt closed network. Thanks to them, Suffolk County was plagued with incompetence and malfeasance. It was the reason the Gilgo Beach investigation had stagnated for so long. All that time, Burke was bending the rules. A serial killer walked free. Just as one of the relatives of a victim told the reporters, there was a murderer out there probably laughing at the sheer incompetence of the government. I almost 100% guarantee that this man is sitting in his home right now, she said, watching what's going on TV, getting the biggest thrill of his life seeing what he has done to those families. And she was 100% correct. The only thing she didn't know is how careful the killer was being about the case. His digital footprint was almost non-existent. Almost. In 2022, after Suffolk County got a chief of police who actually cared about the case, a task force was set up. The ghost of Long Island was about to be given an identity. After years of criticism and dead ends, this multi-agency task force Local police, FBI, New York State agencies pooled together their resources and examined the evidence again. There was pressure on them now after a series of documentaries had made law enforcement look incredibly incompetent. They studied the Amber Costello witness statement again, the dark Chevrolet Avalanche driven by a white guy described as an ogre. When the task force did, just 2 months into an 11-year investigation, they found a man with some very dark secrets. It was as easy as that. All those years of missteps were corrected in a heartbeat. They combed the DMV registration databases looking for owners matching the witness testimony. One of the names that came up was Rex Heuermann. They built a profile. If Heuermann was the killer, he had gone after sex workers, all in their 20s and all of similar appearance, pretty with very small body frames. The women each had clothes or personal items missing when their bodies were found. But that wasn't the only thing they had in common. Someone had contacted them on burner phones the night they disappeared. Burner phones like the ones detectives soon discovered that Heuermann had used. They tracked his real phone through cell phone tower data and found it had gone exactly where the burner phones had gone on the night of the murders. And there were his American Express records that revealed Google Pay payments made to Tinder. He'd used the name Andy, but more importantly, his account linked back to one of the burners. Some women would later come forward and testify that they had met Heuermann online. He had taken one woman back to a house where porn was already playing on a TV in an almost empty room. She said he went upstairs and she heard what sounded like a person banging in another room. Scared, she tried to leave, only for Heuermann to fly down the stairs to try to stop her. Luckily, she had a taser, and with it pointed at his throat, she escaped. Detectives had found one of the emails he used to contact such women, John Springfield, springfieldman9@aol.com. Heuermann might have been clever in constructing this web of digital lies, but it was fast becoming a web he had unknowingly spun around himself. And like the detectives suspected, he had followed the investigation online. They had looked at his online search activity with those email addresses and found that he had accessed a Newsday article entitled "Cops Seek Help in IDing Manorville Body," one of the murders he was suspected of committing. He had Googled, why could law enforcement not trace the calls made by the Long Island serial killer? And why hasn't the Long Island serial killer been caught? Sometimes he would just search for Long Island killer or Long Island serial killer phone call. He had been careful to delete all his online activity, but he had seemingly overlooked the fact that nothing in the digital world ever really gets trashed. That's also how they found out that even though he had a new truck, he had conducted an internet search looking for another. When he wasn't looking for new trucks, he was doing online searches for sex workers, and then looking at what investigators said was sadistic, torture-related pornography. They had him, but it wasn't enough to charge him. Not yet. They needed a warrant to search his properties, and for that, they needed bulletproof evidence. Something physical. They already had what they thought was the killer's DNA. They pulled it off the headless body of victim Jessica Taylor. She'd gone missing from New York at age 20 back in 2003. Heuermann had made it hard for police to identify her. He'd removed her tattoo, what the case files called obliteration. He had cleaned her too, but he had made the mistake of leaving a tiny hair behind. In the files, this would become known as the male hair underneath Taylor. It was human from a head and with Caucasian European characteristics. It wasn't the only DNA evidence. Investigators said tiny trace samples connected to Heuermann or his household were recovered in other cases, although some of those traces only became detectable or usable after forensic technology improved. All they needed now was some of his DNA to match those samples with. On January 26, 2023, Heuermann was going about his daily business in Midtown Manhattan when he was seen throwing a pizza box into a garbage can on Fifth Avenue. Detectives saw their opening. They watched him leave and with gloved hands took the box and the discarded crusts that he'd left. It was sent straight to the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory for analysis. This wasn't the first time they tested his DNA. As soon as he'd become a suspect in 2022, detectives had collected 11 bottles from the family's trash. But the DNA on the bottles couldn't rule out Heuermann's wife. She had not been in the state at the time of some of the murders, but they couldn't be sure that she had never been involved. The pizza box tests came back from the lab. The DNA matched the hair that had been found on a burlap sack used to restrain and transport the body of Megan Waterman. It was his. It had to be, or at least they could prove it didn't belong to 99.96% of the North American population. But there was a problem. The technology used was controversial. Its validity would be questioned in court. But on July 13th, Suffolk County police officers made their move. Heuermann was arrested at his Manhattan office. As officers conducted a body search, they found a burner phone linked to one of his many false email accounts. He had used it to conduct searches on where investigators were with his case. His face was soon all over the world's media. Family man, professional, testament to the saying that there is usually much more to people than meets the eye. His neighbors could barely believe it. "We've been here for about 30 years, and the guy's been quiet, never really bothers anybody. We were kind of shocked, to tell you the truth. It was weird," said another. "He looked like a businessman." But this wasn't over. Heuermann's master plan might have been foiled, but he wasn't going down without a fight. In 2023, he was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, but pleaded not guilty. A 4th charge was added soon after. These were the Gilgo 4. Held without bail, Suffolk County District Attorney Raymond Tierney said this was only the beginning. There were more search warrants to execute, and that was when they turned his house upside down. When they found something that blew their minds. 100 terabytes of data, equivalent to millions of pages. And to top it all off, the 15-page document HK 2002-04. It wasn't just about preparation and body disposal locations. He had given himself advice for future murders. Wash inside all cavities. Remove fingerprints and hairs, marks from torture. Get rid of torture tools, props, and toys. But it was the notes section that showed just how dedicated he was. He had referenced John E. Douglas, the famed serial killer investigator who had once helped the FBI set up its profiling department, the Behavioral Science Unit. In his book Mindhunter, Douglas had written about killers who used a foreign object on their victims. Heuermann's notes mentioned the pages 162 and 163, where Douglas had written that penetration with an object, what he called sexual substitution, might mean the killer is disorganized, compulsive, and perhaps living with his mother or parents. So Heuermann now knew that if he did this to his victims, he might convince investigators to look for a disorganized killer who wasn't married. His notes went further, echoing something Douglas had always told investigators. If you want to catch the artist, the killer, you study the painting, meaning the victim and the crime scene. Douglas had spent countless hours interviewing men like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Edmund Kemper. He believed the killers often leave behind a trademark, a signature. In his own notes, Heuermann reminded himself that investigators would look at the painting, and that the more you do, the more clues you give. He was attempting to create the perfect murder, but his document showed that he was aware he had made mistakes in the past. That's why he warned himself he must always get enough sleep before he took another victim. And hit her harder, he said, because the last one he had to hit too many times to cause her to lose consciousness. As for the rope to tie her up, the last one was too thin and it had broken. And something else. He said he needed to control the air in his torture room, as too many gaps meant too much noise. Follow this advice, he wrote, and on the next murder you'll have more playtime. It was truly disturbing, but it was meaningful evidence. Just about everything he had written corroborated what had likely happened to his victims. Then, in 2024, 2 more names were added to the list: Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla. The latter, a woman who had gone missing in 1993. He pleaded not guilty to all the new charges. Then came another, the murder of Valerie Mack. Her decapitated body, bound with rope and contained in plastic and duct tape, had been discovered in a wooded area of Manorville on Long Island on November 19, 2000. Police also found pictures on his computer that were consistent with the injuries on Mack's body. The rope/cord and saw/cutting tools he'd listed in his blueprints and one of his dump sites were also consistent with what had happened to Mack. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of a female hair found on her body matched the DNA profiles of Heuermann's wife and daughter. They weren't suspects, not officially. Their DNA could have been transferred to Mack's remains. Despite all of this, Heuermann's defense was confident that it would beat the charges. His lawyer called the DNA evidence weak. He told the press that Heuermann stood by his plea of not guilty in a case full of hyperbole and hypotheticals. And more than that, his client, quote, was simply not capable of committing these heinous acts. Heuermann's wife and daughter, the daughter who had worked for him at his Manhattan office, also offered their prayers for the victims. But had they known what he had done? Prosecutors still didn't think so. His wife and daughter weren't even living with him when he had started killing, and his wife had been out of town for the Gilgo 4 murders. She told the media that she would reserve judgment and listen to all the evidence before she said anything more about the case. Still, she had already filed for divorce. It was a nightmare. Their house was a wreck after the searches and the media. People turned up every day to gawk and take photos. It was a very, very dark time in their lives, said the lawyer. But it was about to get darker, because in 2026, another victim was added to the charges. Her name was Karen Vergata, a sex worker. Her partial remains were found in 1996 on Fire Island in the vicinity of Heuermann's dumping grounds. She had remained a Jane Doe until 2023, when improved DNA analysis identified her. She wasn't the only Jane Doe who finally got a name. U.S. Army veteran Tanya Jackson had only been known to detectives as Peaches because of a tattoo, but improvements in forensic techniques identified her in 2025. Her torso had been discovered inside a plastic container in a state park in West Hempstead, New York in 1997. He was charged for Vergata, but not for Jackson. And there was still the case of the woman who had started all of this, Shannan Gilbert. Her family wanted justice. In 2026, Heuermann was brought into court in handcuffs in Suffolk County, a 62-year-old giant in a suit and tie. He was charged with 7 murders and intentionally causing the death of Vergata. The court was packed with the families. Heuermann's wife and daughter were seated right at the back where their faces were out of view. Hundreds of people squeezed into a gymnasium at the police academy, relatives of the victims, journalists, officials, and police, all sitting next to cardboard images of the victims. There weren't many people that day who still believed Heuermann was the typical harmless father next door, but his family was hoping he was. One of the victim's sisters reminded the public that these weren't just sex workers. They had voices, a future, families who loved them. They had been slaughtered by a man who felt that he was better than them. To him, they were just notes in a blueprint, items to dispose of, toys for his playtimes. Now he stood in front of those families, and they weren't expecting what came next. He stunned the court when he confessed to 7 murders going back to 1993. Amber Costello, Jessica Taylor, Maureen Bernard Barnes, Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthelemy, Sandra Costilla, and Valerie Mack. In the case of Karen Vergata, he admitted to intentionally causing death, so that made 8. 8 out of 11 over 17 years of killing. But what about the other 3? Heuermann's defense attorney said his client's change of heart was for a sense of relief, cathartic to some extent. More importantly, Heuermann agreed to cooperate with the FBI. He would tell the truth about what he had done, but the plea meant the gory details would stay hidden to the public. Not even during sentencing would the full extent of his depravity be read out to the families. And that meant his family, too, would never know the truth. Truths that needed explaining, like what happened to Shannan Gilbert. Even in 2026, with all the new information, law enforcement was still claiming Shannan hadn't been murdered. The evidence, they said, didn't stand up. Unlike the other women, she had had a driver that night. Her client and the driver couldn't be connected to Heuermann through all the new data, and his DNA wasn't found at the crime scene. He murdered women that he lured into a trap, but Shannan, it seems, had fallen into one by accident. Maybe one of her own making. Still, it was possible that night that she had accidentally run into Heuermann. What happened, we may never know, but it seems police still believed that she had had a psychotic break. Madness, despite her very coherent 21-minute phone call to 911, despite the fact that she was found without jeans. Something just didn't add up. All these theories and dead ends. It had destroyed Shannan's family. Her sister, Sarah, already struggling with severe mental illness, spiraled into madness. In 2016, in a fit of wild rage, she stabbed and killed her mother, Mary. 2 women dead, another in prison, all from the same family. The architect of Long Island hadn't just designed women's murders. He had drawn a blueprint of suffering that would affect dozens of people for the rest of their lives. He thought that he had beat the system. He almost did. But if there's a lesson to be learned, it's this. If law enforcement serves the public and acts with integrity, and in this case, in the end it did, no matter how well you plan or how smart you think you are, the microscopic truth of modern forensics can catch up with you. Even ghosts leave digital footprints.